this time some do's and don'ts concerning your structure and your style. So once again, let us look at what we're aiming at. We have looked at the 30 marks for content. And that if you want a very good mark, if you want to be in the top category, what you would have to do, how striking and original your content must be. Now, the other 20 marks for your essay comes from two sections. The one is out of 15 and the one is out of 5. The 5, let's start there, is for structure in terms of, is there a very definite structure? Is there a definite introduction, a definite ending, and effective, of course, and then a proper body? And then if you've really met all those, you will have to get a 5 out of 5. Do you understand? It's only when you become really messy in your writing and there's no cohesion and the paragraphs don't follow, etc., that you're going to get a lower mark there. But the 5 out of 5 is if you really carefully plan and if you and if your paragraphs are the way they should be. That is for 5. For 15, it's about language, style, and editing. Note that editing is part of this. I've spoken about editing before, and I've said, if once you have written your final essay, just go through it quickly, edit it, and make sure that you haven't made the odd spelling mistake or concord error or whatever it is. And I said, just draw a neat line through it and write the correct word at the top. If you've written ITS instead of IT apostrophe S, just fix it, and nobody's going to complain and say, oh, but look at the messy work. Just do it properly and neatly, and everybody understands that is editing. In fact, it will enhance your essay because they will see that you actually did some editing. You did leave a little bit of time to go over the final essay and to check. So it's actually a plus point. I hope you understand that I'm not saying that you should, keep it as few as possible, but evidence of editing is important. So the language, the style, and the editing. Here in this section, you just stand back for a moment. You've looked at the content, and you stand back for a moment and you think, I'm going to look at the essay now from a different point of view before I give the final mark. I'm going to look at your tone. Is your tone appropriate? Right? At your register, how formal or informal are you writing? And is it appropriate for the essay, for the audience? Is it appropriate? And what about your vocabulary? Is it highly appropriate to the purpose or not really? Appropriate to the audience and to the context. So you look at the language just from a different point of view, right? And you're going to look at the sophistication of the language. How well is this written? How good are the figures of speech? And how sparingly did you use those figures of speech or the odd image just for effect? How well did you choose your verbs? Did you overstate, or have you done some purple writing, just flowery stuff? What have you done? In other words, how effective was your language use? You're going to look at that. So also in terms of the tone, let's say, for instance, you're writing a descriptive essay on the sounds of your neighborhood or the sounds of your town, right? And you have written about how you're lying in bed and you're listening to, the various sounds, and you're describing the sounds that you're hearing and so forth, and also the other sensuous things that you are describing there in terms of how you feel within this town of yours and what the sounds make you feel like, etc. Does it make you feel as though you're at home, or does it scare you, or what is it? So, in other words, how compelling is your writing in terms of the tone that you're bringing across? Is it an affectionate tone? In other words, are you writing and bringing across the tone that, oh, you just love the sounds because it makes you feel at home, makes you feel that you belong there or something. If the tone is sort of pulling the reader along, you see, that is the kind of thing that we're looking at in this section. You're going to look at the grammar and the spelling. Look, you can even get a full mark for an essay if you have one or perhaps two little minor, errors in your essay, like a little stupid spelling error. You can even, especially in an exam situation, still get a full mark. But try, of course, to have your essay as error-free as you can. And sometimes those errors are just like honest mistakes or something. So people overlook that sometimes. If the rest of the essay is just so fantastic that, wow, you have to give a full mark. So it might, but don't think that you're going to lose a mark for every grammar error. Now I'm counting the grammar errors. These are my major mistakes and these are minor mistakes. They used to mark like that. It's terrible. And then it had this major impact on your essay. It's not quite like that anymore, but check for grammar and spelling, but edit it nicely and see that it's as error-free as possible. Okay? And also they're looking at the crafting of your essay. How well have you crafted it? Have you plunged the reader into the main action in the first paragraph? Does that capture the attention? What have you done? How did you craft it? Did you have this surprising twist in the end, the ironic twist? Have you left the reader in the end to think, to wonder? Because you've left the ending open. So you don't actually say what really happened in the end. So the reader must think for himself. You have this ellipsis idea in the end. So how did you grab the reader's attention and pull the reader along? That is what is looked at in this section. And you do get a mark out of 20. Eventually for this entire section, but out of 15 for this part, and 5, of course, for structure. So you can see that all these things overlap. I mean, you're not going to have this compelling, wonderful, rhetorically effective essay if the content doesn't sort of also fit, and if the content isn't that brilliant. And normally you can't really have like a very, very high mark for content and then a very low mark for style and structure, because it doesn't work. They do go hand in hand, and the structure and so forth, it's all important. And eventually, after having looked at the various parts, you look at the essay as a whole again and say, no, I'm going to push this one category up here because it was actually brilliant. And then you put together the mark out of 50 eventually. Things to avoid in terms of structure and style. Of course, those stereotype, boring introductory and concluding paragraphs, please. Those paragraphs that just hang in the air and they're not connected. There's no logical coherence or cohesion. There's very little development of the topic. You have just sort of scraped the surface and said a few superficial things. So you have not really explored the entire topic. You've just sort of done a little bit here and a little bit there. And be careful, very careful in terms of style. I've spoken about language and I've spoken about ways of writing. It is very, very, very common for writers, well, learners especially, to use sentence fragments instead of full sentences. You have to write full sentences. For instance, you, as the writer of this essay, might think, wow, this is great. You might even think this is a great sentence, when in fact it's not even a sentence at all. Look at this. Gazing at the stars above, brightly scattered across a velvet expanse, becoming to the solitary sky searcher. What doesn't even sound like a sentence? But you've got what you've got is you've got a gazing at the stars, brightly scattered across a velvet expanse, becoming to the solitary sky searcher, this, that, and the other, whatever you've added. But the point is, you are just using parts of sentences. If you look at that, there is no finite verb, like walking along the beach, looking at the waves, throwing a ball, basking in the sun. Okay, it gives me a picture of what you do when you're on holiday there, but it's not a sentence. It's just a series of fragments. You must use full sentences. It must have a finite verb, please, and a subject. And if you use gazing, the present participle, please, where are the auxiliary verbs to make them finite? Careful. You might think it's very impressive, and it's actually not an aspect of style. Don't say, oh, but I did it for stylistic effect, because you are going to be penalized for that kind of writing. And also things like comma splices and so forth. If those things are all over your essay, your mark is going to go down. Also, loading nouns with adjectives. If you think every noun must have an adjective and another adverb that will help describe, no, use sparingly, effectively, make every word count. Be careful of using cliche, right? I'm going to read you a little example just now about how somebody took a cliche and then turned it into something fresh. But be careful of just saying the cliched thing. About switching tenses, as a general rule, don't switch tenses. If you write in the past tense, stick to the past tense. If you write in the present tense, stick to the present tense. Except, of course, if you use flashbacks and flash forwards, and you want to place the reader within a certain situation, and you want the reader to feel that moment with you, but then you stick to the present tense, the dramatic narrative throughout that paragraph. Do you understand? You can't just go willy-nilly, just do a bit of present here, a bit of past. It must have a purpose. So be very careful of doing that. How can you enhance your structure and your style? A very interesting technique that some learners really do very well at. They change point of view. They give you an incident and so forth. Say, for instance, somebody has jumped from a 10-story building and has fallen to the ground. And what you're given is the point of view of the mother running down, of perhaps the person lying there that's perhaps not quite dead yet, from a bystander, from a little child. So in other words, you get the perspectives from various characters, and that just gives you this moment from so many angles. And it allows for such a variation, and it becomes very interesting. So even when you describe a town, like even from various characters' point of view. The old man sitting on the veranda, or the young girl cycling along, and just different perspectives, different ways. And that's where, what you have noticed about what other people do and written down the little details, you can start using those to make your writing more interesting. So writing from various points of view, or even from using time shifts, now this, now that, time shifts, this flashback, flash forward kind of thing. If you can make use of that cleverly, it can be very interesting. Make use of contrast as well between movement and noise. For instance, in a descriptive essay, I've spoken about you lie in your bed and you write about lying in bed and hearing sounds of your. How does the silence feel? How does it sound after this terrible noise of the ambulance coming by? Make use of contrasts like that. Juxtapose scenes. In other words, place them side by side for comparison. Juxtapose actions. The cycling girl, the sitting old man. Dialogue, the way she speaks, the way he speaks, right? Make those things count. What is also interesting is using a circular approach where you start at a certain point and then you end at that point again. And you just fill in the rest in the middle. A circular approach, which is not strictly chronological. Deliberate repetition is also very effective in terms of style. The repetition, let's say, for instance, you have thrown this fantastic figure of speech at the reader in the introduction, and you consistently draw that figure of speech through, even by just obliquely referring to it, or just having a word suggest it, and then perhaps bringing it in the end again. So in other words, a repetition of certain words or certain nuances of the same word, because that also creates a kind of unity, right? So deliberate repetition also helps. Sometimes of a line, sometimes of a phrase, sometimes of, whatever you want to have repeated, but it's very effective. Or figures of speech, nuances of words, and that also helps to give you unity of thought. Vary your paragraph lengths and your structure, the way in which you put your paragraphs together. Of course, inside your paragraphs, your shorter and the longer sentences to give a rhythm there, and sometimes use a one-line paragraph or a one-word paragraph. A paragraph can be one word, wow, or whatever it is. It can sometimes say so much, and it can help, take your essay further. So one-line paragraphs, one-word paragraphs can work, but once again, don't ever overdo anything. It must count for something. It must mean something. It must have effect. Fine. Let's look at further ideas. Always important to remember to plan. If you don't plan, it's as clear as daylight, and you're going to lose marks for structure. It's just one of those things. If you don't have a logical sequence, you're going to lose marks there. And connectors, you're going to lose marks. Use for your introduction certain methods. Make it clear to the reader that you have planned this, that you have planned even the method, in other words, the style of your first paragraph. In other words, are you going to plunge them into action, and how are you going to do it in your introduction? These things must be carefully planned and used to effect. And of course, if your ending, plan what twist of irony are you going to use there? What what are you going to do with your reader when you get to the end? How are you going to resolve this, or aren't you going to resolve it? And how are you going to put it to the reader? So the construction and the length of sentences, we've talked about that. We've said use repetition, use anticlimax, use juxtaposition for stylistic effects. We have already said most of these things. But if you need to really think about this when you are writing. Otherwise, you're just going to write whatever comes to mind, and you're going to try and fill up 400 words and say, oh, this is my essay. No, it doesn't work like that. There must be structure. Look at the following example. I've spoken about using cliche that you must avoid, but everything I say can actually have a tail to it and say, however, if you do this and this, it might just bring something very fresh to the fore. So look at what happens here. You have all heard the expression that somebody is stick thin. It's a cliche. You think, oh, how original, stick thin. But listen to what Terry Pratchett did with this cliche. He was well over 6 feet tall, but stick thin, like a normal proportioned person, modelled in clay by a child, and then rolled out. Can you see what he did? He took the stick thin and he made it so clear what this person actually looked like. It's as though a child that had modeled this little stick figure, and then he took something and he rolled him out. Now he was flat and thin like that, and that is what he looked like. That was what his stick thin looked like. So suddenly you have this freshness in an image when it's actually a cliche, right? So take whatever I say with a pinch of salt, because you can always make something interesting. Also, Terry Pratchett talking about camels. There seem to be hundreds of them here, complaining like badly oiled pumps. Can you imagine the sounds that they're making? And smelling like 1,000 damp carpets. Can you imagine those camels, what they smell like? And what the sounds they make? Can you imagine those? So another hint or two. Think, whenever you're using your words, think of alternatives for neutral words. Like, for instance, talk. Talk is neutral. Talk, walk, etc. Neutral. Instead of saying talk, you can talk about chin wag. You chin wagging. You tattle. You pontificate. You lecture. You prattle. So the words within a certain context just will sound right or not right. I mean, use the appropriate word because it's descriptive, right? And very importantly, listen to this little extract from Lord of the Flies. Excellent description. Excellent description and use of verbs and images. Let's read it quickly. Smoke was rising here and there among the creepers that festooned the dead or dying trees. As they watched, a flash of fire appeared at the root of one wisp, and then the smoke thickened. Small flames stirred at the bole of a tree and crawled away through leaves and brushwood, dividing the increasing one patch, touched a tree trunk and scrambled up like a bright squirrel. The squirrel leapt on the wings of the wind and clung to another standing tree. Can you picture the fire in the woods? Now suddenly, look at this wonderful image about the bright squirrel. It scrambled up the tree like a bright squirrel. Excellent choice of imagery. So try and be as fresh and original as you could possibly be. That's the answer.